So should be going live on Facebook and on YouTube. So coming up, folks, blimey, Struth, running a couple of minutes late. People. Coming up in just a couple of minutes. Fill the blanks. What's going on with that? There we go. 2 minutes, people. 2 minutes, good people. If you're watching an archive version, you might want to just fast forward a couple of minutes. One minute, people. Oh, hold on. Blimey, that's it. Oh, Struth. Oh, no. I'll tell you what. It's Easter Monday. Do you know what I mean? Easter Monday. Right, here we go. Hey, folks. Good afternoon. Good morning. Good evening. Good people. And welcome to the Daily Chaos. Bit of Easter chaos today. I'm Olly Connelly. Thanks for turning up. And now, China! How big is a threat from the nation whose nation is may you live in interesting times, but it's not a kind wish, it's a curse. English Democrats Chairman Robin Tilbrook considers that EU implosion and more with me now. Want to call in? Get Zoom, and then browse to, well, the link's up there in the spiel. Yeah. Right, okay. Robin Tilbrook, God bless you. Good to have you back on the show, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, nice to be here, Olly.
Good to have you. Let me grab your video, pop that up. And thank you very much indeed for popping back in. When you were here a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the Coronavirus Act, which who was it? So some of the MPs in the Commons were saying was dystopian.
Steve Baker.
Yes, Steve Baker was saying positively dystopian. Didn't want to go so far, he said, as totalitarian, but going in that direction and a little bit concerning. In fact, he was crying about it in the Commons. And we talked about this. When we discussed that, I was very much on the fence as to what way to think about this whole thing and whether or not those powers were necessary. But as the days go on and we're in our quarantine, lockdown, what have you, around the world, and we're hearing about these hugely inflated, massaged figures about COVID-19 and wondering quite who we can believe, I'm kind of really worrying here if there is some kind of a globalist agenda at play to use this thing to the advantage of big business that is intranational, that doesn't give a stuff about old Blighty, far less the people that live there, for example, and ditto for nations across the world.
Yes.
What are your thoughts? How concerned are you that this coronavirus crisis is being used to roll in totalitarianism?
Well, I mean, it certainly is being used to change the whole way in which we're allowed to interact in any way with the state. I mean, just as a for instance, the Daily Telegraph today has got a series of articles about police policing beaches and so on in North Wales, and the police officer has been going around saying to people who are sitting down on the beach that they've got to keep moving. Well, the interesting thing is that the regulations don't say that. So there's a police officer doing a PR thing in which he's basically acting without any legal authority, because if you think about it, it doesn't actually make any sense to be saying to people who are quite a distance away from any other people and are also outside. It doesn't make any sense to say that there's any sort of quarantining reason for why they're not allowed to sit down. That's something else altogether. It seems to me that it's all about telling ordinary people how they've got to behave, rather than anything actually to do with quarantining. And the other thing you were saying, Olly, about the figures. First of all, I'd like to say I was watching the news yesterday, and we'd got the official government spokesman telling us that we'd passed this sort of grim milestone, as they put it, of 10,000 deaths. But if you listen carefully to what they said, they didn't say 10,000 deaths caused by coronavirus. They said 10,000 deaths associated with coronavirus. And that's an important difference, because there's been a study done of the Italian statistics for coronavirus deaths. It turns out that they've been including quite a lot of people who have not died from coronavirus itself. They've died from other causes. Mm-hmm. So if you took an extreme example, if you were hit by a bus and you were killed by the bus, and they then checked your body and found that you were developing coronavirus, but you were totally asymptomatic, as they're saying. In other words, you weren't showing any symptoms of it. You would be counted in the Italian statistics as a coronavirus death. And there's a Swiss doctor who's basically done an analysis of the Italian statistics, and he reckons that up to 85% of their statistics are questionable. And what that means, obviously, is that a very large proportion of the Italian statistics aren't actually deaths caused by coronavirus. They are deaths where they are associated with coronavirus.
That's right.
And
that's right.
May not be causation at all.
Just a quick interjection there, Robin. Just a lot of people have heard this already on this show. For example, about 3 weeks ago. Well, no, it was before then. It was about the 24th of March. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control, the US government agency, they're kind of like mini WHO, if you like, put out an alert telling medical staff on death certificates, if there is any doubt that there is that the patient suffered from COVID-19, put that on the death certificate. If then there is going to be an autopsy or what have you, then if that changed and they decided there wasn't a contributory factor of COVID-19 or the person didn't have that in their system, it would nonetheless be retained in the statistics regarding the mortality rate. In other words, it's all grossly inflated in terms of these statistics. And the argument for this, if you like, soft martial law that we have so far depends, does it not, on these statistics?
It does. I was talking to a medical practitioner earlier today, and he was telling me that yesterday they produced a figure of over 700 deaths associated with coronavirus. He was saying, and I'm afraid I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's 700 and something or other. And of those, 30 approximately, he was saying 30 something or other, were deaths where the person didn't have known significant underlying health issues, or some expression like that they're using. And of those 30 that didn't have known underlying health issues, quite a lot of them were very elderly. One of them, I think, was 93. So actually, if a 93-year-old had caught flu, it might well be that that person would have died from it. Yes. The fact is, it every year something like I think it's 600,000 people die in the United Kingdom, and so our statistics of over 10,000 now dying associated with coronavirus isn't as big a statistic of death as it sounds if you don't know that the background is that you've got hundreds of thousands of people dying every single year. In any case.
Yes, absolutely. There is there is, according to the CDC, as I just explained, definitely misdiagnosis going on. To what extent, we can't be sure. On the other hand, Robin, it has to be said that this is creating a problem in health services around the world. And therefore, from that point of view, even though this disease may not be, and apparently is not, anything like as serious as initially perhaps we were concerned about, looking at places like Wuhan, there is still a very, very strong argument that the lockdown was necessary, in order to protect health services.
We will know this, whether it was or wasn't, but only with hindsight, because there is one Western country that has decided not to do lockdown altogether, and that's Sweden. And if the Swedes do not have significantly different numbers of dead to the rest of us, we will know that lockdown was a complete waste of time. Yes. And wasn't actually doing what our authorities have been making out that it's going to do. I mean, my instinct would be that lockdown will reduce numbers or spread them out, because I think what we've got to bear in mind that in the end, the whole lockdown thing isn't actually about curing people in any way. It's not about anything to do with the disease directly itself. It's actually about NHS management.
Yes.
And the general weakness of the NHS in terms of the numbers of doctors per head of the population, the numbers of intensive care beds per head of the population, all of which the NHS actually doesn't perform very well at by comparison to most European countries, let alone other countries around the world. So it's basically about trying to spread out the infection rates so that the NHS is able to cope. And what I'm told by people who are working in the NHS is that at the moment, a lot of the accident emergency wards they're not empty, but they are certainly not full. They're sort of say 3/4 full rather than fully full. And that's why, of course, they haven't needed to use any of the emergency beds in the O2 Centre in London. We've got a situation where we're sort of over catering for some of this. There are other areas where we're not catering so well. Two things. One is the various sort of protective gear for medical practitioners who are coming into contact with people with coronavirus.
Yes.
That we're not supplying enough of that equipment. I mean, and part of the reason is, of course, during the course of a working day, a doctor's or a nurse is going to be using half a dozen of these sets of equipment. You can't reuse them. And they're not made to be washed or anything like that. So consequently, you need a vast supply in order to be able to cope. And they hadn't got that supply in the stock. And the other thing that's happened that's I think worth mentioning about the NHS is that quite a lot of the NHS management have gone missing in action, and basically they are working from home. They say, and what that means, of course, is that there isn't that much sort of management impact on the way that the hospitals are working. And I hear that what the consequence of that is that there is some risk attached to going into hospital at the moment because they haven't really managed to properly patients who've got the coronavirus, and
that's very interesting.
You'll be in a ward probably with people who might well have it.
That's right. We'll talk a bit more about PPE, this protective kit, in a minute.
Could I just mention one other thing, Ollie?
Yes.
You said about Wuhan and the statistics there.
Yes.
I think it's we need to be extremely cautious about any statistic or any statement that comes out of China. The fact that they're saying that the numbers are down doesn't necessarily mean the numbers are down at all. No. In fact, on the contrary, it may simply be that the Chinese have decided that the way to go with it is to carry on as if there isn't anything happening at all and deny it. Because what they are doing, for sure, is they are using this whole situation to buy up things and to generally improve their economic and strategic position.
Right, you're jumping the gun, sir.
And they will be seriously more powerful at the end of this than they were at the beginning.
We're going to come on to that because that's actually the crux of the discussion I want to have with you today that really, really concerns me looking forward. If I ask you, as chairman of the English Democrats, to put on your political hat just for a second, I just wonder, so far as the NHS is concerned, and as, for example, in the UK, and I'm sure nations around the world are reconsidering their priorities in terms of, for infrastructure and social services and stuff like that. Certainly we're seeing that in the UK, not least of all from the British Prime Minister. It really does go to show, does it not, this whole crisis, the chronic lack of investment in NHS training in the UK. Wonderful to have people helping out from around the world and what have you, but UK-based nursing training, where is that for doctors? How significant is that? And also manufacturing. It just seems to me incredible that we're relying on China to send us dodgy kit, things that are just having to be thrown away because they're no good.
Yes. You're thinking of the two nurses, are you, that Boris Johnson mentioned, one of whom is from New Zealand and the other one of whom is from Portugal?
Well, first of all, let me say I've got full respect for anybody that is working,
Yeah.
in healthcare, wherever.
But
they're
your
from
point,
or what
your
have
point
you.
was about our failure to train our own people.
Well, I guess actually the biggest point I have is if you look at the shock to the economy now, and God knows what the figure's going to be, how the GDP is going to be depressed by all this.
I gather the Chancellor of the Exchequer is beginning to panic about that, actually.
But actually, we would have probably saved a lot of money and been far, far better poised to cope with the situation had actually we had a far, far better investment structure and supporting industry for the NHS and healthcare services generally in the UK. No, is that not a huge political point going forward?
Well, it may be. I certainly do gather that those countries that are closer to China and therefore have experienced more difficulties with the two previous recent plagues that China's unleashed on us. Their reaction was more prompt, and their systems obviously were more geared to dealing with another epidemic.
South Korea and Japan, you mean?
Yes, but the thing I think you've got to bear in mind is that it isn't really just about the NHS, is it? It's also about the whole globalization agenda, because basically one of the reasons why we've wound up with quite a high infection rate here is because we have actually been having quite a lot of people coming from Wuhan or wherever it was that it actually started in origin, the airports are still open, apparently. One of Boris Johnson's arguments with Priti Patel was over whether or not to shut the airports, and Boris Johnson wanted them kept open. So you could still have people coming from China to here, but they're not tested when they arrive.
Beggars belief.
Sorry?
The beggars belief.
I know, but they're not tested when they arrive. The gates are still open, as it were. Most ordinary people are required to stay at home most of the time, but we're still allowing people to come into the country untested who may well have the disease.
That's right.
It's quite an extraordinary situation, really. It takes us back to question marks about what it's all about, really.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It seems to me as soon as they locked down Shanghai, it was pretty clear the WHO should have been saying, right, all non-essential travel to China is off. But nothing.
It doesn't it raise an issue really about what China's up to? Because obviously China has carried on with international travel, but at the same time they're denying any further cases. Or any significant further cases. So, maybe we have actually got an agenda that's emerged there for the Chinese as to what they're trying to do, that they are happy to spread it because they're winding up finding that they are actually able to use the chaos caused to improve their sort of geostrategic economic position.
Okay, let's get into that. Before we do, couple of things. First of all, good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Boozy, Chris Boozy's popped in, stateside stringer for Daily Chaos. So please, Chris, join in. We've got Robin Tilbrook here from the English Democrats. If you're watching this, do us a favour, please share the show. You're on YouTube or Facebook, wherever. Like it, subscribe, all that helps. Thank you. And let me just read a few comments, see what people have got to say. Dr. Dawson, Simon Dawson, who popped on Saturday. Hey, Simon, it was lovely, mate. A massive insurance scam and whistleblowers are coming out from the NHS speaking out. So therefore they will cancel your life insurance, and the government are backing it with the Bill Gates life insurance, and the government are backing it with the Bill Gates Foundation and a massive profit from vaccines. I imagine we'll touch on that in a little bit. Nikki Pattinson, do the government really have a choice, or are they told what to do by the elites, aka Bill Gates and crew? Lots of chatter, actually. Lots and lots of concern, Robin, about Bill Gates' role in all this. Bill Gates, who is perhaps best famed for having given us all so many viruses on our computers and blue screens and what have you. In fact, he gave me, personally, so many blue screens that I was prompted to write this book, which is a 468-page book about how to secure the web. And so, yeah, I know a thing or two. I actually credit Microsoft at the front of that book for inspiring it. And now he seems to be, I don't know, according to some folks, creating more problems, and then offering the solution or what have you. It is curious. I understand.
There's certainly an interview, isn't there, of him talking about his virus investment in viral vaccines, antiviral vaccines, and he does sort of finish off sounding rather happy at the idea that he thinks he's going to get 20 times what he's paid into it in the way of profit.
And he is also saying now that his vaccines, there will be a risk factor. In other words, they could harm you, and that his company or foundation or whatever must be indemnified by governments around the world in the rollout of these vaccines. In other words, one, they might not work, and two, we want to be guaranteed that we cannot be sued.
And three, we want to make mega profits.
Yeah. I
mean, an ordinary businessman thinks he's done pretty well if he gets 100% profit. To get 20 times what you put in, that is a huge level of profit.
Boozy, I suspect you are champing at the bit to come in at this juncture.
Let's put it this way. I'm going to draw some war comparisons. Now, some people may not think that that's valid, but I personally think this is effectively a war. First point, and these could be maybe things we could talk about. One, if we're in a war footing, why are we not dealing with critical infrastructure by use of a mechanism such as the Bradbury Pound? Two, why are we getting PPE from an aggressor? Would we really have tried to obtain gas masks from the enemy forces in World War I when they were using mustard gas against us? And three, in relation to Bill Gates, if we do view this as a war, is that not just war profiteering?
Are we at war with China, or at least in a Cold War, Robin?
We're not in a war as such, but it is worth bearing in mind that the sort of go-to book for Chinese decision makers, after they finished with the Chairman Mao, the thoughts of Chairman Mao in the Little Red Book, they are generally encouraged to have studied carefully Sun Tzu, The Art of War. Mm-hmm. And obviously Sun Tzu's idea is that basically you win conflicts without actually technically going to war. Your whole approach should be to win without a war and without a fight. I don't know whether that's exactly what's going on, but it certainly could be. And I think you should never discount the idea that key Chinese decision makers are gaming what's going on in the way that Sun Tzu talks about. Sun Tzu, for those people that haven't read him, firstly I'd say good idea to do so. There's the way it works is that there's a relatively sort of short bit of what was originally verse in Chinese, and the idea is that you've got this little saying, and you're supposed to then think about that rather than what a Western book would tend to do, which is explain what the idea was behind that. You're supposed to ponder what the sage has said. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll give you, for instance, of one of his famous sayings. I may not have got the wording exactly right, but it's something along the lines of, know thy enemy, but not thyself. 60 battles, 30 victories. Know thyself, but not thy enemy. 60 battles, 30 victories. Know thyself and thy enemy. 1,000 battles, 1,000 victories. That's the saying, and then you're invited to think about that, and obviously to ponder the need to understand both yourself and your enemy. Mm-hmm. Sun Tzu's general sort of philosophical position is really like sort of Machiavelli on steroids. You know, he is a thoroughgoing advocate of completely cynical manipulation of your opponents. He's not at all. He's totally dry-eyed about it, and he's looking to try and philosophize ways of winning, as I say, without actually fighting. And so, if that is the kind of thinking that we're up against here, we are sort of at war. But it's I suppose the difference is there's no actual outright violence, and it's certainly not any sort of declared war, is it?
A couple of things regarding that then. First of all, I'm beginning to read some reports, not many, about the build-up in the South China Sea. So Chinese positioning seems to be moving on there, which has been a concern for the last 10 years, I suppose, one way and another. Yes. But now with countries like the Philippines and Malaysia having to pull in the reins really, and concentrate on the turf as opposed to on the water, they are less able to guard against that build-up. Similarly, also with the United States fleet, although Trump has said that he wants to invest a lot of money in the South China Sea fleet, but at the moment China is gaining dominance there. The thing that perhaps is more concerning is, as you suggested, and I said we'd come on to, this concern to nation states having their national assets bought up by China for potentially pennies on the dollar type scenarios, where companies are having the stuffing knocked out of them in terms of their value. China comes in, buys them up. This is a real worry, They're doing something about it in Germany, I think. They've got
not only the stuffing knocked out of the company, it's also the value of the currency itself being very much lower than it normally is. So China is, Chris was mentioning the Bradbury pound. China is a country which is has a so-called fiat currency. So in other words, the currency only means what the state says it means. Otherwise, it's just paper, isn't it?
Confidence.
and of course, because they are in control of that, they are buying assets with, in effect, paper. And at the moment, much less paper than they would normally need to do. So they're going to be able to buy a lot more than they could have hoped for without this. And I think their approach is exemplified by a story that I was reading earlier today, which is that when there was all the talk about what was happening in Wuhan, the Italians sent a load of medical equipment and protective clothing and so on to Wuhan for the Chinese to use for free as a charitable thing.
Mm-hmm.
Turns out that the Chinese didn't use that, but what they are doing now is they're selling it back for payment to the Italians. And they also there was a massive effort to try and buy up all the necessary equipment for dealing with this in the months after the Wuhan became known that they got a problem there. So they have actually they do seem to be using the crisis. I think that's. It seems to be clear that they are doing that, and I think that does take us back to Chris's idea about what they're actually trying to achieve, and that it is a sort of war. It's probably on the side of von Clausewitz's sort of saying, isn't it, that war is politics carried on by other means. Well, this is sort of politics carried on by sort of conflict means, shall we say, rather than full-out war.
Germany has put into law protections for German companies against foreign takeover during the coronavirus crisis, according to Breitbart. What's the British government doing? Anything? Nothing.
Nothing. German companies were always more difficult to take over anyway, because you've got trade union representation on the board and so on, and the shareholding system isn't the same as ours. Our shareholding system and the way that boards operate is much more open to takeover, unless government actually says that a particular company can't be taken over by whoever it is that's trying to take it over. Normally speaking, you can just buy British companies.
According to Breitbart.com, this is dated the 10th of April last week, Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage has warned that Chinese interests are lining up to take advantage of the coronavirus crisis by buying vast swathes of our strategic and manufacturing industries. What is happening right now is that Chinese companies and Chinese money are lining up for what they expect to be a fire sale of British businesses, Mr. Farage said during a Facebook live stream last Wednesday, mentioning that Germany has put into law protections for German companies against foreign takeover during the coronavirus crisis. He continued, "I fear we're going to allow China in to buy up vast swathes of our strategic and manufacturing industries, and it just can't be allowed. The problem is the same mob that sold us out to Brussels are now happy to sell out our sovereignty once again to China. And this needs a much bigger, higher level of debate." Robin, you are well known, famous, sir, much loved for that writ against Theresa May, trying to overturn her extension of Article blimey, what was it? I can't remember now. Extending the Brextension from the 29th of March last year, when we were supposed to have left, and according to you, we did leave. Tell me, what is our biggest threat going forward now? The EU? And we're not out of it yet, seems to me. We're still in the CU, still in the SM, still in the ECJ. We ain't got Brexit yet, Boris, sorry. What is the bigger threat going forward? The EU or China?
I it's sort of I would sort of look at it the other way around. What it is that our political media and business elites are not really interested in protecting our national interest. In fact, in many cases, they don't even recognise it as a valid concept. They're just not interested in it at all. And so, in a way, the unwillingness to protect us from Chinese economic penetration, is very much the same type of attitude as we've had with the EU. There we've been more sort of politically, obviously tied in. But it was interesting, I think, that one of the first decisions that the Boris Johnson government took, with its massive majority, and it can therefore make more or less any decision. It could therefore make more or less any decision that it wanted to. One of the first decisions it took was to say yes to the
Huawei.
Chinese Huawei paying a key part in the 5G development.
30%.
That was in direct opposition to everything that the Americans and the other sort of Anglo-Saxon nations were basically saying, that they wanted to not have a back door open to Chinese intelligence.
That's right. I've written chapters about backdoors and rootkit attacks in there.
Yep.
Boris, read it. WordPress 3, Ultimate Security. It concerns a lot more than just WordPress.
I think you'd struggle to get Boris to read something as serious as that. He's not got much of a reputation for reading a lot of serious material, has he?
That did beg a belief that he would basically put a company which, by Chinese law, has to spy on whatever, if it's told to, by the Chinese dictatorship. And that a British Prime Minister would give them 30% opportunity to spy on us or whatever, and in turn, Five Eyes, ruining Five Eyes. It's incredible. But Huawei is a Tory donor, aren't they? Isn't that the problem? Is this not good old-fashioned fascism?
Yeah, I don't know whether it's fascism, but it certainly sounds pretty dubious, doesn't it? The idea that lots of senior people within the Conservative Party, influential people, should be on their boards, paid by them. But then you see the thing about China, although it is a communist country, it's a sort of country where the theory about totalitarianism rather works, because they are the country that's most fixated on race, for instance, at the moment. Mm-hmm. I mean, they are a country where the bits of their territory where the Han people are not the majority or weren't the majority, they're working very hard to get it so that everywhere the Han are a majority. And if you are Han Chinese, it doesn't matter whether you've got a Canadian passport, British passport, or a Chinese passport. If you're in China, you will be treated as being Chinese. And they won't take any notice of the fact that you've got a foreign passport, because they reckon, in the way that they're operating, that everybody who's Han Chinese is Chinese, whatever their documentation may say.
Maybe we could take a little bit of a note out of their book there, actually, instead of allowing people to come into the UK and change our pre-existing culture.
They're of course expansion. They're using.
They take it to an extreme, though, don't
expansion. So, for instance, in Tibet, for a long while now, they have been changing the demographics of Tibet to make sure that the Han are the majority. And of course, we're getting some reporting about the fact that there is concentration camps been set up to deal with the Uyghurs, and they are Muslim Turkic peoples in the northwest of China. And that was an area where the Han were a minority, but the government has been working. The Chinese government has been working very hard to make the Han the majority there. And I do think this whole concentration camp business is part of achieving that, because they're trying to wipe out the traditional culture of the Uyghurs. They're also trying to stamp out Islam, and one of the ways that they've been doing that is they've been taking the children away from Uyghur families and re-educating them. What I'm saying that is an illustration of just how determined the Chinese so-called Communist Party are to create a sort of ethnic dominance of the Han people across the whole of territorial China.
I want to bring Boozy in to ask his opinion on what he's heard so far. Before I do, I just want to take a few comments from folks. Charles Spencer, Boris only went into hospital to keep away from his nagging wife for a few days. Truth Gambit says, comment on a Russian channel. This is the first pandemic in the history of humanity that is transmitted solely through media. Communications in commas, he says. William Davis, Dominic Raab needs to keep Boris out of number 10, as he is a better leaver than Boris ever was. Steve B says, my local MP, Dr. Julian Lewis, is one of very few that completely understands Huawei, leading to Defence Select Committee explaining to treasonous May. And Steve B says, no to Huawei, no to Huawei, no to Huawei, no to Huawei. And he says it another couple of times. Nikki Pattinson, what happens if China refused to pay the multi-trillion fine the US has imposed? Very curious. Maybe we can hark back to that, gentlemen. Very curious that people are beginning to talk about suing China. A few comments over on Facebook. Lorna Batchelor says, why has the entire Western world sold itself to China? Madness. Yes, please, let's hark back to that point as well. And maybe we can just talk about some of the history from Kissinger with Nixon and where it all started. Sarah Boland says, yeah, we could do with stamping out Islam too. Well, Sarah, there's about 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, or the figures are unknown, just like coronavirus in China and everywhere else for that matter, but up to 1 million people in concentration camps. I'm not sure that's the way to...
Olly, could I just say...
yeah.
I do think there's a sort of iconic symbol that tells us quite a lot about the way that the Chinese Communist Party think about the world. And that iconic symbol is Mao Zedong. He's on their currency, and the massive statue of him dominates the sort of central square of Beijing and Tiananmen Square. So he's he's still very iconic within China. But you are talking there about somebody who is undoubtedly the greatest mass murderer in human history. With up to 95 million people that he organised to be killed. So that tells you quite a lot about the way that the regime thinks about things. I rather think if you've got as one of your iconic idols, as it were, within the iconography of your state, somebody who is a hugely prolific mass murderer, what does that say about how willing you are to lose a few million here or there? The people, they're not going to be that bothered, are they, about whether the current policy means that a few million people die?
Chinese or not.
And I also think it's probably worth contemplating, answering one of the questions that you had, what the Chinese would do if they wound up with a large order to pay damages with sanctions attached to them if they don't pay them. I think that's probably a moment at which they would think, well, this is a good opportunity to nip out those bits that we think that ought to be part of our country, like Taiwan, for example. Yeah. I would think that would be an opportunity for the Chinese government to do what tyrannies often do when they get into domestic trouble, which is have a war, a real shooting war. They might well use that as the moment to take back, as they would say, Taiwan. A moment of danger.
Boozy.
Okay, there's one thing about the Huawei that I was actually talking to a friend about and realised that I can talk about some of it because the late Margaret Thatcher actually mistakenly spoke about it and declassified it by speaking about it in the media. And that is something called Tempest. Now, our intelligence computers are protected against Tempest. This is basically, if you want to think, Tempest is a way that you can look at what's on somebody else's computer from another room. Now we have protections against that within our, because we developed the technology to do it. We've got the technology. Us and the Five Eyes community have the technology established within our SCIFs and that to protect us from our data from being able to be accessed by this means. 5G, the reason why they cannot have any access, someone like China cannot have any access to our telecommunication system, is if you put 5G into the mix, the 5G can negate those protections. Therefore, it doesn't matter if you don't give them access to the secure communications. By having them have access to any of the communications through the 5G network, through a 5G network, you effectively give them the back door, because of the way the technology works, to the secure communications, even when you say, oh, but they're not going to have any interconnection with that. Basically, because of how the technology works, they are going to be able to get through those protocols, which is why America is so strong. China is now talking about potentially having Huawei because, well, they've got a deep state puppet in charge. And the question on EU and China is who's the biggest threat? Well, the same threat, because they're both part of this globalism, where the deep state wants a one world government, and this is the way having a resurgent China, having an EU as a prototype for a single world government. These are all part of the same blob, so they're part of the same enemy. I do think we have a real problem here, where we have politicians who put party before country, because
back pocket.
Well, yeah, and pocket, but a lot of that the party and the pocket go hand in hand a lot of the time. Like over here, we've currently got Dianne Feinstein, a California senator, basically who actually has Chinese spies on her staff. She's got Chinese spies on her staff, and is now basically saying that she wants $5 billion for the Iranian government for medical aid. It's like we can actually trust the Iranians to do it. I just think we've got a lot of problems where the problems come from us trying to trade and deal with anyone.
But
Sorry. If we go back 1,000, 2,000, 1,000, 1,500 years, there were countries that were our sworn enemy, and we would have absolutely nothing to do with them.
That's right. That's right.
And those countries that would trade and deal with everyone were usually the ones that got squashed first. History teaches us that actually sometimes if you know that someone is absolutely beyond the pale as a state or as a people, you just cut them off. And the thing with Taiwan
China.
and those things, yes, those are a concern. That's why, I don't think we need to be doing it as a UN or anything. Those us countries that have been screwed over by this Chinese bioweapon need to actually speak with one voice and say, no, you owe us this money. No, we are not going to pay you any debts we owe you because you owe us more than the debts that we've incurred. We don't care. And if you do try aggression on anyone, we will, with united voice and united fists, come at you to defend those places.
Okay, Chris, hold it there. Hold it there. Robin, the problem is, though, we've opened up a Pandora's box, haven't we? Kissinger went over there with Nixon and shook Mao's hand and all that, got them together, opened up the floodgates, and basically we are here as a direct result of that with this.
But obviously that was done for geostrategic reasons to try and break the communist bloc and the tie between the Soviet Union and Mao's China. And obviously it was
ultimately,
well, it was successful at doing that. But of course, the USSR then dissolved, fell, collapsed, and we then didn't change our policy on China. So, for instance, the Americans had China as a most favoured trading nation right up until quite recently. I think I'm right in saying up until Trump, but at any rate, very recent. And the Chinese have their reaction to what happened in the Soviet Union is that the Chinese Communist Party is absolutely determined not to allow it to happen to them. And they are prepared to use any means necessary to make that, to prevent that. I mean, obviously, they did show that very clearly with the student protests in Tiananmen Square, where they simply crushed many of the students with tanks. But, wherever they are faced with opposition, they are absolutely ruthless. And then they are determined not to go the way of the Soviet Union. So what we're left with is a situation where we have got a totalitarian regime, but it's a very heavily armed one. Chris was saying about to fight them. The Chinese Red Army is the largest employer on the planet, with over 1 million men under arms. It'd be quite an arse to take them on.
It would. That's the problem, isn't it?
Certainly, with our something like 70,000 soldiers, there's no chance.
No, completely. It has to be a Cold War, I suppose. But
then there are a lot of
that would escalate.
There are a lot of people in elite positions and in positions of power and influence and money who are on the side of the Chinese.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, you really got to think about the way that the media is reporting. They're far more interested in attacking in England the Conservative government, or in America Trump, than they are in calling out what China's got up to. I mean, even to the extent of making out that it's some sort of racist gaffe to even mention that the coronavirus might be called the Chinese virus. That seems to be more important to them than the concern about what China's actually up to.
Very worrying indeed. Let's take a few more comments, see what people have got to say. Leslie Martin says, the Soviet Union does not exist anymore. Russia, Christian. Sam Phipps simply says, follow the money. Mark Patrick Conway, we have never had a recession. We have cuts or borrowing over the hilt. Warren Whiteley is pointing out the United Kingdom Corporation. Amin Armoud, I don't trust them with that. They've gotten away with treason already. He's referring to a comment from Sam Phipps, who said, anyone who trusts the UK government with anything other than a teddy bear's picnic is nuts. Dawn
If the teddy bears were out having a picnic, they'd probably be arrested at the moment.
Dawn Maudsley Wilkinson is asking you, Robin, do you think there's going to be a big recession, or do you think the economy will bounce back? Recession or depression?
Well, I think it could be just it could be a full-on economic collapse. I mean, that's the real worry, because you've got to bear in mind that even during the sort of great historic problems with the economy, like, for instance, in the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression and so on, we never had a point at which the economy actually stopped. The economy never paused. The amount of trading went up and down, but depending on what was happening with the economy, but it never actually paused. What we got here is a situation where the economy has been largely paused. And it's
paused
worth
or
bearing
trashed? Paused or trashed?
It's worth bearing in mind that a lot of businesses are quite marginal. They're not cash rich, not sitting on piles of cash. They are pretty marginal, and that's particularly true things like shops and pubs and a lot of the sort of basic ways in which we tend to think about how we're going to consume. So, I mean, most restaurants, for instance, haven't got very much money. A small change in consuming patterns can mean that even apparently quite big enterprises crash. I mean, we've had Debenhams go down in the last few days in the UK.
They have, in fairness, been struggling for many years.
They have, but they make my point that they were quite marginal.
Yeah. It's like I have my own business with my wife. We conduct weddings, like just officiate weddings, and we were going to use different technologies, because people don't necessarily see it, because they go, oh well, you're being paid just to do this, there's not, but there's all the additional things, the bills that you have for your website, your sites for getting where you get your clients from, all these things. So actually, at the moment, I'm just for the most part, I'm just putting the money out. Because there's nothing coming in. And I was going to, until I got my quarantine thing, where I was basically put on a precautionary quarantine, I was going to be willing to go to people's homes and just kind of on the download. Yeah, we'll just go around to someone's house. Yeah, do the wedding and stream it on Zoom, and that way you can in effect have the guests come in, and we were just going to do that as a way to keep the business going and keep some money coming in. But obviously we've had to up our price. We had to up our prices because what we were charging, we were so marginal that we weren't really paying the bills for the company. So, and it is one of those things where my business, I'm going to have to pay my state taxes and all this, and At the moment, a lot of my bills are kind of going into the to be dealt with pile, because I'm actually considering, is it better for me just to wrap up the business and restart again later? But there's risks in that as well.
Yep.
Okay, quick fire round. Just very, very brief answers, if you would, Robin. We've got about 10 minutes left, sir. Cashless society. Is that where we're going?
Well, certainly there's a lot more cashless transactions going on at the moment, with people being encouraged in bigger shops to do contactless paying of shopping bills and so on. Whether that's a long-term position, I'm not so sure. I'm still locally here. I've still got places that prefer cash. Every now and again, there's a move to try and get rid of cash. The banks would like to get rid of cash and checks. They think that gives them much more control over what's going on with money. I think governments also quite like the idea of cash, getting rid of cash, because they then have got more track of who's actually got any money.
Yeah.
And it sort of clamps down on the black market.
Yeah.
But at the same time, for most people, I think cash is still very attractive to have that, rather than to have to use credit cards and
one of our last freedoms, really, isn't it?
It certainly is a freedom, definitely, and it would be a bad thing to lose it.
I just wonder if this is being used as an excuse. Again, the media's been, if you like, giving us the hypodermic needle effect over the course of the last 10 years or so about how we have to go towards this kind of cashless society. I
think the trouble is we are in the middle of something, so it's very difficult to see exactly what's going on. Really, if you're like a sort of fish in a fast-flowing river, the fact that you seem to be stationary in the water, but the rocks keep flashing past.
Yes.
You might think it's the rocks that are moving, mightn't you, rather than you are.
Yeah, you're right. But on the other hand, we do have to be questioning these things and really trying as best we can to look ahead now, because otherwise we might just end up in a place that we really do not want to be, and we've had no.
Well, I'll give you another thing I'm worried about. There's I saw that the CEO of BT was saying that he thought that this was the moment at which BT could help the government by allowing a system, setting up a system that would pinpoint where each mobile phone is. So the government then be able to work out who'd been in contact with who.
Yeah.
And in the vicinity of and where they'd travelled and everything else, because on the basis that you've got your mobile phone with you. Well, this is something that's happened in China. The Chinese have created the Chinese government created an app, so I gather, that basically allows them to say whether you're going to be red, orange, or green pass. If you've got a green pass, you can go into buildings on the basis that you're not a risk of having the coronavirus. But a red pass, you're not allowed to move at all.
That's right.
And
what is it? Health passport.
The app itself gives the police the opportunity, like Chris was saying earlier, to get into the data of whatever's on the phone. Yeah. So there is a really big risk to our freedoms at the moment. And the state has been given dictatorial power over us with the Coronavirus Act. And what we just need to be absolutely crystal clear about is that we're not going to tolerate that at the moment, that any danger, whatever the level of the danger is, which we were discussing earlier. But once this immediate danger has passed, we need to have our proper freedoms back, and we need to be very watchful as to exactly what they're trying to hang on to in the way of powers over us.
Going to
I
come
would
back
actually
to that.
say,
Go on, Chris.
I would actually
Sorry,
say, Robbie, we've already had prior to this a large kind of attack on civil liberties. I think there needs to be a bit of a quid pro quo here. And okay, we allowed you that extra bit of dictatorial power to deal with this. However, the situation needs to be, once we come out of this, that you have to give us, not just take us back to the status quo of where we were, but you actually need to return some of our rights that you, and our liberties that you infringed upon. You need to actually give some of those back as well. So not only is it a case of you need to take us back to status quo, but if we see the line of liberty, they're taking us this way, and this is the status quo. We need to say to them, well, you've took us this far back. Now you need to take us to here.
Now, that would be great, Chris. The difficulty we've got here, though, is, of course, we've got a government that's obviously pushed all this through. I don't even know how long they will hang on to dictatorial powers. They can do it not. Although the Coronavirus Act looks on the face of it as if it's limited to 2 years, if you actually read it carefully, that can be hung on to. And they only need to come back to Parliament every 6 months for a renewal of it. It doesn't take any imagination to think that if that starts becoming convenient, they might well just enact it to be permanent.
Yeah,
well,
I get your point on that. I'm just saying that this needs to be. Unfortunately, there's too many people with their head in the sand who go, "Stay home, save lives," and rather than actually.
But the slogan is "Save the NHS," surely.
Yeah, exactly. This slogan thing with their heads in the sand, where we actually need as a people to, not just in the UK, not just in the US, but globally, we need to say no. We don't want to be China. China can fuck off. And we don't want to replicate them. So we're going to stand up and we're going to say, we are going to have our civil liberties. And if you don't like it, we'll put someone in place who will. And we ain't joking on that. And we need to be with such a resounding voice that they go, because the only thing that scares a politician who's elected is scared about is not getting re-elected and getting off the grave and losing the gravy chain. So we need to make it very clear to them that it is in their interests economically, i.e. by keeping their jobs, to do as they're bloody well told.
That is very worrying.
We've also got the Fixed Term Parliaments Act to think about, Chris, which means that basically Boris is in, come what may, until 2022, isn't he?
Well, maybe that should be looking at that. Maybe that could be something that could be challenged constitutionally. Once he gets rid of the Supreme Court that he says he's going to do.
Does he?
Hit him with
Is
it
he
then.
saying that? he was talking. He was kind of huffing under his breath a bit about the Supreme Court off the back of them overturning the
it's
prorogation.
Just Tony Blair's political deep state court. It's not.
But
it has no
is
constitutional basis in the UK.
Is he going to reform it, even let alone abolish it?
Well, I don't know is the answer to that one. The then Attorney General Cox had said we should be looking at changing the selection process for the judiciary, in particular the justices in the so-called Supreme Court, which I agree with Chris is not a proper Supreme Court at all. But the lo and behold, the next thing that happened was that he was sacked. So I'm not at all optimistic that Boris is in fact going to do anything about the Supreme Court.
So, just to be clear, this Coronavirus Act, Robin, you think that the 6-month reviews basically add up to a hill of beans, and that we're looking at this thing being in place for 2 years, or what?
Well,
Because
no. What I'm saying is that the Coronavirus Act gives, as I say, dictatorial powers. Some people have been saying that it actually gives more power than the Enabling Act in Germany in 1934, which I don't think is much of an exaggeration, to be honest. But it shows you the level of power. They've suspended elections under it, for instance.
yes,
And every 6 months at the moment, the government has to come back and get a continuance. But the point is, even after the 2 years are up, if they get a vote of continuance, they can carry on. And you've got to bear in mind that the government
sounds a bit like Brexit.
They've got it. Yes. Well, it has an impact on Brexit, because it means that Boris doesn't actually really need to come back to Parliament about it.
That's right.
He can do whatever he wants to.
That's right.
And after the 2 years are up, they can still carry on with it. And I think there are really two rather worrying facts that one needs to think about in order to work out what's going on, or to have some idea what's going on here. One is, the Blair government did enact the Civil Contingencies Act, which would have allowed the government to take dictatorial powers anyway under the emergency. The issue, though, was that allowed Parliament to still continue to have a sort of supervisory checking role as to what was going on. Which the Coronavirus Act doesn't allow. And the other thing is that when the government was saying that it needed the Coronavirus Act to get through Parliament, and pushed it through with very little scrutiny, as you and I were talking about last time we spoke, with Steve Baker making his emotional comments, that they got that through Parliament, but the very next day, the regulations on our movement came through, and these regulations aren't under the Coronavirus Act, and of course it's impossible to imagine that a document of this sort of size could have been produced within 24 hours. No, these regulations are not under the Coronavirus Act. They are under the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984. So they had the power already in law to do the restrictions that they wanted to do. They must have had this document already prepared.
Yes.
And the moment they'd got the dictatorial powers, they then wheeled it out.
Robin,
So why did they bother? Just to go full into that. Why did they bother with the Coronavirus Act if they didn't need to?
That is the $1 million question. Why, indeed, when they actually had the power to do the restrictions under the Control of Diseases Act, 1984. 1984 being an ironic date for the act, I suppose, given the famous book about 1984.
Busy.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there also an element within the Civil Contingencies Act that actually had a requirement for elections if certain things, after a certain amount of control and periods, that there was actually a requirement that after being allowed those additional powers, that there was a requirement that elections would need to be held to kind of ensure that there wasn't these certain abuses did not occur while the Civil Contingency Act was in place, i.e. if you abuse this, you're going to basically face the people, and the people are going to vote you out, so you better not abuse this. Wasn't there some kind
Well,
of
there were some checks and balances with the Civil Contingencies Act. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the position was on elections, but various lawyers have been wondering publicly why the government chose to rush through this Coronavirus Act, which was enormous, 350 pages or so of legislation. There were lots of last-minute alterations being done. One of the things that we talked about on the last occasion was Naz Shah pushing for special rights to be given to Muslim and Jewish people to bury their dead immediately and jump the queue. All of these sort of various things were pushed through with the sort of amendments upon amendments. It was all done very quickly. There was relatively little scrutiny, and I think what Steve Baker was saying demonstrates that, because he was saying that he hadn't had a chance to read it through properly, but every time he opened a section and looked at it, he saw something else that made him want to sort of cry out in despair, because it's yet another sort of horrific anti-libertarian, anti-liberal measure. And actually, just whilst I'm on that topic, I'd just like to say that not only did they produce these regulations restricting our movement under a 1984 Act, but they were also sneaking in various other regulations, which nobody had the time to look at, one of which the Christian Concern Group did manage to spot and made a fuss about before they managed to get it through, which was radically changing our abortion law to make it much easier to get an abortion and to push through abortions. And this was being done without any public discussion whatsoever, or even without any awareness that they were trying to do it. It was only when it was spotted that there was an opportunity to oppose it. So
it really
I'm quite suspicious as to what exactly is being slipped through without us really being aware of it.
Okay, very last couple of questions, Robin, and got to actually go and take a pee, frankly, as much as anything. Are we going to get Brexit on the end of December, in your estimation, sir?
I hope so. But we are hearing more and more stories being put out that it's going to be delayed. And I think the sort of noise, you're hearing these stories being talked about, we're also we're not getting as much protest from the Remainers about what's going on as you would expect if they thought that it was actually going to go through. I am quite suspicious as to what's going on. And of course, when we talk about Remainers, I think it's worth sort of branching off onto another point, not actually dealing with your question, and that is the new Labour shadow cabinet. Not a single lever on it.
No.
All Remainers.
That's right. That's right. And largely the kind of people that let the mass rape, torture, murder gangs perpetrate.
Well, the new shadow community secretary, Naz Shah, she's the one who retweeted and liked the tweet saying that the Rotherham girls who'd been raped should shut up for the sake of diversity.
Well, when I looked at that, the shadow cabinet, I have to say it was kind of a who's who of those people who were allowing and supporting the institutionalized abuse of children, because you've got the leader of the opposition, you've got Naz Shah, Angela Smith, who was the Home Secretary under Gordon Brown, has made the shadow leader of the House. you get what effectively. So you basically, it's a who's who of treasonous people who oppose civil liberties and support the widespread abuse of children.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go quite that far, but then I'm within reach of a libel writ.
You know, I don't. I'm sorry, Robin. I'm not a leader of a political party. I don't have to pull punches.
And you're also out of the jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Okay, we could get into what.
But
Tim
I do
Porter's
think
view-
one of the weaknesses, to follow up on that, of Keir Starmer is, of course, that he was actually the DPP whilst the Director of Public Prosecution, whilst quite a lot of the sort of mass Muslim child rape gang activity was going on.
And Savile.
That's right. None of them. None of them speak out about what Jackie Smith said. The diktat she sent to British police forces around the country, telling them to ignore those heinous crimes.
Starmer personally,
Gordon Brown's government.
Starmer personally was saying that they were not to consider the ethnic origin of either victims or perpetrators.
Yeah. And yet none of those victims were Muslim, were they? And so it was a religious hate crime as such.
Well, I mean, you could say it wasn't just religious; it was racial, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well,
okay.
There were Sikh girls. It was white girls and Sikh girls. So there were also
there were some Sikh girls. Yes.
Yeah. So
Not very many.
I would say
that's right.
But not
Muslim.
thing is, it was an aggravated crime at the very.
Yes. I mean, in any where that whole idea of racially aggravated crime was being fairly applied, it would definitely have been applied to them. But it's not fairly applied, and of course, as we're on Keir Starmer's shadow cabinet, we've got to think of the new shadow Justice Secretary, David Lammy, who is the author of a report saying that basically black and ethnic minority criminals should be treated more leniently than white indigenous English people.
Yeah. Look, I'm not in any way denigrating this topic. It's something that's very close to my heart. We talk about it so much on this show in detail, but we are really running out of time. So I've got one last question for you, please, Robin. I just wonder, because the last 10, 15 minutes sounds extraordinarily concerning about the intention or the possible intention, last hour and a half actually, of we've been talking, very, very concerning about the possible intention of this government and the kind of characters that are in the parliament. But Boris has had arguably a life-changing experience in the last week or so. Might he be a changed man? Might he cancel Huawei and resist the China syndrome?
I don't know whether we can. We can speculate, but I don't know whether we've got anything to go on as to what extent he might be changed.
No.
The one thing I can say is I do think that quite a lot of the left really showed themselves up, because we had a sort of storm of comments from leftist figures wishing that he died from the disease. And the interesting thing is that basically, if you look at Labour support, there's quite a lot of people who are traditional Labour support, their father and grandfather before them, type of mentality. But there's also quite a lot of people who basically want to be nice about things, and a lot of that type of person was very shocked, because they were people like most most people who were wished whatever their view as to Boris's politics, they wished Boris well personally and wanted him to get better. Mm-hmm. And for people to be openly saying that they hoped he'd die, I think opened a few eyes as to just how nasty and unpleasant quite a lot of the left are. And I've been saying, and I was saying earlier about Mao Zedong, it is worth bearing in mind that in the 20th century, the two greatest mass murders, and probably the greatest mass murders in all human history, were communists, were leftists, Mao and Stalin. Mm-hmm. The left supported both of those. So we were still at a point where John MacDonald in Parliament a couple of years ago was waving the Chairman Mao's little red book, and Diane Abbott had been saying that Mao did a lot of good things. And these people are out there, and they do genuinely wish death and destruction to anybody that opposes them. And when they've been in power, people like that, they've often put that into physical effect and killed lots of people. So
Robin Tilbrook.
It is something that we need to be aware of in the left.
Damn right. I want to say a big thank you again to Robin Tilbrook, chairman of the English Democrats, one of our Brexit heroes, and also Chris Boozy, Daily Chaos stateside stringer. God bless you, Chris. Thanks for popping on. And we could have gone on and on and on and on, but instead of that, Robin, would you, because one of the wonderful things about this show at the moment is it is dead simple procuring guests, yeah, because everyone's in quarantine.
Yes.
Would you come back, please, very soon, sir, and we can expand on this and see how things are going, and please.
Of course.
Bless you. Oh, and you, Boozy.
Yeah.
I don't know actually what's happening tomorrow, because I don't know. I haven't got there yet. Dennis Spain in Hawaii, who was he's coming on Wednesday now. He's coming on Wednesday, and he's going to be going through a bit about the US Constitution and breaking some of that stuff down and talking about fractional banking and basically the way they print money out of thin air. Got an Australian lawyer who is half Turkish and half Greek coming on Thursday, which should be very, very interesting. And Mark Windows on Friday. And I think Finn is back on Saturday to talk about licking toads in the Nevada desert, stuff like that. Light relief on the Saturday show. Mind you, it wasn't, was it, Chris? We ended up talking all about blimey. That was a hell of a show with old Finley on Saturday. Yeah. Right, so yeah, Monday to Saturday at 5 p.m. GMT or BST or UK time, whatever it is. That's 12 noon in EDT or whatever it is, Washington DC, Mr. President. So come and tell us. Actually, you know what? He said something about China earlier.
China now.
Come and tell us what's going on with that drain into the swamp, Mr. President. God bless you for crying out loud. Lock her up. And catch you tomorrow, folks. Ciao, ciao. That was Daily Chaos. I'm Olly Connelly. Still am. Ciao. Yeah.